The heavy oak kitchen table groaned under the weight of endless stacks of paper. Past due invoices for ranch equipment, endless rows of charity funding requests, tax forms, and logistics reports formed a mountain of white across the polished wood. The afternoon sun filtered through the sheer curtains, casting long, dusty shadows over the accumulated bills. Norma stared at the chaotic pile, her hands trembling slightly as she rubbed her temples, feeling the suffocating weight of managing a sprawling Texas estate and a massive philanthropic foundation. The sweet, smoky scent of burning mesquite wood drifted in from the outside, a smell that usually brought her immense peace. But today it was entirely swallowed by the chilling, suffocating silence of a profound betrayal. The scene shifts abruptly to the rustic hallway of the family guest house on the outskirts of San Antonio. The solid oak door of the new, perfectly efficient assistant was left slightly ajar. A cold bluish light from multiple computer monitors bled out into the dark hallway, clashing violently with the warm, welcoming atmosphere of the country home. The visual shock was absolute and paralyzing. The walls of the bedroom, once decorated with simple, honest Western art, were now entirely plastered with clandestine photographs of the family. There were detailed maps of the private property, printed patrol schedules of the ranch hands, and silver flash drives neatly labeled with the names of unreleased, deeply personal recordings belonging to the King of Country himself. The sacred sanctuary of a legend had been violated. A tall, unmistakable silhouette appeared silently behind Norma in the dim hallway. George held his worn Stetson hat in his weathered hands. He did not shout. He did not curse. He merely observed the treachery unfolding before him with the freezing calmness of a man who knows exactly how to protect what is rightfully his. The vast, dusty expanse of the Straight family ranch in South Texas was a place where the sun beat down without mercy and the earth demanded respect. The smell of raw leather, wild horses, and dry dirt permeated the thick air, creating an environment where hard work dictated the rules, and a man's word was worth infinitely more than any signed piece of paper. It was a place built on Christian values, humility, and the sweat of honest labor. But managing such an empire of land and charity had taken its toll. Norma was exhausted. The endless paperwork, the foundation events, the logistics of keeping the ranch operational had drained her spirit. In a moment of vulnerability, seeking to restore the peace of her home, she made the decision to hire outside help. She needed an executive assistant, someone who could handle the modern complexities of their vast responsibilities. Enter Chloe. She arrived from the concrete canyons of Chicago with a flawless resume, glowing recommendations, and an attitude polished to a razor-sharp edge. When the sleek black luxury SUV crunched onto the gravel driveway of the ranch, Chloe stepped out looking like an alien entity, dropped into a classic Western film. She wore a tailored designer suit that looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of the rolling Texas hills. Her expensive, pointed shoes immediately sank into the dry red dirt. Oversized designer sunglasses hid her eyes, and her posture radiated a distinct aura of polished superiority. She looked around the sprawling property, not with admiration for its natural beauty, but with the calculating gaze of an auditor appraising a distressed asset. George, the stoic legend, walked down the porch steps to greet her. The sound of his boots on the wooden planks was steady and grounded. He extended a calloused hand, offered a respectful nod, touched the brim of his hat, and spoke with that familiar, calming baritone voice. He welcomed her to Texas with the genuine hospitality that defined his entire existence. But George had spent a lifetime reading the unpredictable weather of the plains and understanding the silent, nervous body language of wild mustangs. As he looked at Chloe, his sharp eyes caught something deeply dissonant. There was a rigidness to her smile, a cold calculation in the way she quickly scanned the perimeter of the main house. The alarm bells in the cowboy's mind were quiet, but they were undeniably ringing. The inciting incident happened subtly, almost imperceptibly, masked by the clinking of silverware and the smell of roasted beef and warm cornbread during a quiet family dinner. Chloe had been flawlessly efficient during her first few days, organizing the chaotic office and streamlining the charity files. But as they sat around the dining table, she casually wiped her mouth with a linen napkin and asked a seemingly innocent question about the security protocols for a specific heavy iron safe located in the back corner of George's private study. Before the silence could fully settle, she casually mentioned the title of a song. It was not a famous hit. It was not a track that had ever been played on the radio. It was a deeply personal, sacred piece of music George had written for his family 20 years ago, a song that had never been registered, recorded, or played outside the thick walls of that very house. The air in the dining room seemed to instantly drop 10 degrees. George slowly set his fork down on the porcelain plate. He did not react with panic. He simply looked at Chloe, his expression unreadable, his mind racing to understand how a stranger from Chicago knew the name of a ghost. The seed of deep distrust was firmly planted in the dry Texas soil. As the weeks dragged on, Chloe rapidly made herself indispensable to Norma, managing schedules and handling the overwhelming tide of emails with ruthless corporate efficiency. But behind Norma's back, the assistant's true nature began to leak out like toxic oil into a pure stream. Her interactions with the ranch staff revealed a dark, condescending arrogance. She treated the hardened ranch hands, the loyal foreman, and the dedicated cleaning staff with poorly disguised disdain. To Chloe, these hard-working people were nothing more than ignorant country folk who could not possibly comprehend the fast-paced modern world she came from. One scorching afternoon, the air thick with the smell of approaching rain, Chloe stood on the porch and sharply berated an older ranch hand for tracking a small amount of mud onto the outdoor patio. She barked orders at him, her voice dripping with venom, demanding that the men with dirty boots stay entirely away from the main house. She treated them not as human beings, but as broken tools. George stood in the shadows of the barn, watching this interaction in absolute silence. His jaw tightened. He valued his men above almost anything else. These were the men who bled into the soil, who woke up before the sun to keep the ranch alive, who prayed before their meals and helped their neighbors without asking for a dime in return. Chloe's blatant disrespect shattered the moral code of the ranch. She was violating the fundamental rule of the Texas countryside: you treat every soul, from the wealthiest landowner to the humblest stable worker, with the exact same level of dignity. The tension in the house grew thicker than the humid summer air. Small, seemingly insignificant items began to change places. Keys to the filing cabinets were mysteriously moved. The advanced security system of the main house experienced inexplicable, brief failures during the dead of night. Norma began to feel a creeping sense of alienation within the walls of her own home. The sanctuary she had built was being slowly dismantled by Chloe's aggressive micromanagement. The lowest point came late one evening. The house was quiet, save for the sound of crickets outside the window. Norma sat on the edge of her bed, looking at George with tears of exhaustion in her eyes. She confessed that she deeply regretted bringing the outsider into their lives. She felt she had lost control of her own home, her own charity, her own peace of mind. Simultaneously, down the dark hallway in the guest house, the camera of the narrative focuses on Chloe. She sat bathed in the sinister glow of her laptop screen. She was not organizing charity events. She was rapidly copying massive, highly confidential digital files from George's private server. She held a sleek silver cell phone to her ear, laughing cruelly with a contact in Los Angeles. Her voice echoed in the sterile room, mocking the family, bragging about how incredibly easy it was to deceive these rich, gullible country people. She was a corporate fixer, a ruthless tabloid informant hired by shadowy media figures to steal unreleased musical masters and fabricate scandalous lies about the famously reclusive King of Country. She was preparing to destroy a legacy for a paycheck. If you want to see how the King of Country uses the quiet, unstoppable power of Texas justice to protect his home and teach this arrogant intruder a lesson she will never forget, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now, because the real storm is just about to hit. The suffocating heat of a Texas Tuesday afternoon pressed down on the ranch like a heavy, invisible blanket. The air was entirely still, thick with the scent of dry earth, baked mesquite, and the distant electric promise of a late summer thunderstorm. Dust swirled in lazy circles behind the tires of the black luxury SUV as Chloe sped down the long gravel driveway, heading toward the city limits of San Antonio. She had been sent to handle a series of complex banking transfers for the charity foundation, a task she had eagerly accepted, likely viewing it as another opportunity to siphon private financial data. Back at the main house, the sudden absence of her sharp, clicking heels and her constant condescending demands left a profound, ringing silence in the air. Norma stood in the kitchen, looking out the window at the sprawling pastures. Despite the deep, gnawing intuition that told her something was terribly wrong with the assistant, Norma was a woman raised on the unwavering principles of Southern hospitality and Christian grace. She believed in kindness, even when it was difficult. She believed that a harsh heart could be softened by a gentle hand. Seeking to bridge the growing, uncomfortable gap between them, Norma decided to perform a simple act of care. She walked to the laundry room and gathered a stack of freshly washed, thick cotton towels, still radiating the comforting warmth of the dryer. She stepped out onto the back porch and carefully snipped a few stems of wild lavender and yellow sage, tying them together with a piece of rough twine. The smell of the fresh herbs mixed with the clean scent of the laundry, creating a fragrance of pure, honest home. Carrying the basket, she made her way down the rustic, shaded walkway that connected the main house to the guest quarters. The wooden floorboards creaked softly under her boots. She pushed open the heavy door to Chloe's room, intending only to leave the basket on the bed and quietly depart. But the room felt entirely wrong. The air inside was uncomfortably cold, the air conditioning cranked down to a sterile, chilling temperature that banished the natural warmth of the Texas afternoon. The space, which had once been a cozy haven of woven rugs and handmade quilts, now felt like a sterile corporate bunker. As Norma stepped forward to place the towels on the mattress, the toe of her boot caught the edge of a thick, geometric rug Chloe had brought from the city. Norma stumbled forward, her hands flying out to catch her balance. She crashed heavily against the massive antique oak desk pushed against the far wall. The impact rattled the heavy piece of furniture. A sharp, mechanical click echoed in the quiet room. Chloe, in her arrogant rush to get to the city, had been careless. A false bottom drawer, expertly retrofitted into the antique wood, had not been fully locked. The force of Norma's stumble caused the heavy wooden panel to slide open with a sinister, smooth glide. Norma caught her breath, rubbing her bruised hip, and looked down. Her heart stopped beating for what felt like an eternity. The basket of warm towels slipped from her trembling hands, the wild lavender scattering across the cold floor. The drawer was a terrifying abyss of calculated betrayal. It was not filled with charity ledgers or foundation schedules. It was packed with the cold, hard tools of a corporate mercenary. Norma's wide eyes darted over the horrific inventory. There were tiny, matte black micro cameras, small enough to be hidden in bookshelves and flower vases. There were high-capacity audio recorders with blinking green standby lights, devices that had been silently capturing every private conversation, every whispered prayer, every moment of vulnerability within the walls of their home. But the hardware was not the most devastating part. Stacked neatly beside the electronics were thick, glossy contracts bearing the letterheads of the most notorious, ruthless gossip tabloids in Los Angeles. The legal documents outlined massive financial payouts in exchange for exclusive, fabricated scandals. And beneath those contracts lay the ultimate violation. Norma reached out with a shaking hand and pulled up a stack of photocopied pages. She recognized her own handwriting. Chloe had systematically photographed and printed pages from Norma's private diaries, her personal reflections on faith, family, and the struggles of managing their demanding life. Beneath the diaries were dozens of pages of handwritten lyrics. They were George's private, unreleased songs. Songs about his deepest sorrows, his unyielding love for his family, and his quiet conversations with God. These were pieces of his soul, stolen and packaged to be sold to the highest bidder. A lesser woman might have collapsed in a fit of hysterical tears. A lesser woman might have grabbed the phone and frantically dialed the police, setting off the exact media circus the intruder was banking on. But Norma Straight was a daughter of the Texas soil. She possessed a quiet, unbreakable strength forged by decades of standing beside a legend and weathering the storms of life. She did not scream. She did not panic. She slowly, deliberately placed the stolen lyrics back into the drawer. She pushed the heavy wooden panel until she heard the faint click of the lock engaging. She picked up the dropped towels, set them neatly on the bed, and walked out of the room, pulling the door firmly shut behind her. The heat of the sun hit her face as she stepped back outside, but she felt entirely cold. Her boots crunched against the gravel with a new, determined rhythm. She bypassed the main house completely and headed straight for the massive red-painted barn at the edge of the property. This was George's true sanctuary. The smell inside the barn was grounding and deeply familiar, a mixture of sweet feed, oiled leather saddles, and the dusty, comforting scent of the horses. The massive wooden beams overhead filtered the harsh sunlight into soft golden rays that illuminated the floating dust motes. George was standing in the center aisle, quietly brushing the coat of his favorite quarter horse. The rhythmic, sweeping motion of the stiff brush against the animal's hide was the only sound in the cavernous space. He wore a faded blue denim shirt, his worn leather gloves dusted with horsehair. He murmured softly to the animal, a tone of absolute peace and respect. Norma stopped a few feet away. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the smell of the hay filling her lungs, giving her the courage to speak. She told him everything. She did not rush her words. She described the coldness of the room, the hidden drawer, the cameras, the contracts, the diaries, and the stolen lyrics. She spoke with a voice that trembled not with fear, but with a profound, righteous sorrow for the violation of their sacred home. George did not stop brushing the horse immediately. He took one more long, slow sweep over the animal's shoulder. Then his hands went entirely still. He slowly lowered the brush to the wooden bench beside him. He took off his leather gloves, one by one, and slapped them softly against his thigh. He turned to face his wife. There was no explosive rage in his demeanor. There was no theatrical screaming or breaking of objects. His reaction was a display of stoicism so absolute, so chillingly calm, that it commanded the very air in the barn to stand still. His jaw tightened, the muscles flexing beneath his weathered skin. His eyes, usually so warm and welcoming, darkened into the terrifying slate-gray color of a brutal Texas thunderhead rolling across the plains. He closed the distance between them and placed his large, calloused hands gently on Norma's shoulders. His touch was a silent promise of absolute protection. He looked deep into her eyes, acknowledging the pain and the violation she had endured. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously low, carrying the weight of a judge about to deliver a final verdict. He told her that in Texas, when a rattlesnake slithers into the house, you do not burn the house down to get rid of it. You do not panic and let it strike. You step back, you gather your men, and you cut the head off the snake with one clean, quiet strike. The big city hunter, with her designer suits and corporate arrogance, had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the people she was trying to destroy. She had just become the prey. George stepped away and pulled his old battered cell phone from his pocket. He dialed a single number. He did not call his lawyers in New York. He did not call his publicist. He called the ranch foreman, a man who had worked the Straight land for 30 years, a man whose hands were permanently stained with soil and whose loyalty was forged in iron. George spoke quietly into the receiver, giving a set of precise, unyielding instructions. He told the foreman to gather the men. Every single ranch hand, every stable worker, every man that Chloe had looked down upon, insulted and treated like dirt. He told them to meet him at the old auction barn on the far south side of the property just after sunset. The wheels of justice were set into motion, not with the chaotic noise of sirens, but with the silent, unified movement of working men who protect their own. As the afternoon wore on, the sky above the ranch began to change. The bright, punishing blue deepened into rich, bruised shades of purple, dark orange, and fiery red. The sun began its slow descent below the horizon, casting long, menacing shadows across the pastures. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves of the oak trees, whispering a warning that the storm was finally arriving. George walked back toward the main house, his boots hitting the dirt with a heavy, purposeful cadence. He was preparing the ground for a lesson in respect, a lesson about the sanctity of a man's home, and a demonstration of the quiet, devastating power of the Texas countryside. Chloe was driving back toward the ranch, entirely unaware that the trap had been flawlessly set, and that the ground she was about to walk on was no longer safe. The heavy black tires of the luxury SUV crunched aggressively against the gravel driveway, tearing through the profound silence of the Texas night. The sky above the ranch had transformed into a vast, terrifying canvas of bruised purple and pitch black, illuminated only by the erratic, jagged flashes of heat lightning dancing on the distant horizon. The air was incredibly thick, heavy with the suffocating humidity that always preceded a violent summer storm. The sharp, metallic scent of ozone mixed with the dry dust kicked up by the vehicle, creating an atmosphere that felt electrically charged and dangerously unpredictable. Chloe shifted the vehicle into park, the harsh glare of the headlights illuminating the front porch of the main house. She killed the engine, and the sudden quiet was immediately filled by the deafening, rhythmic chirping of thousands of cicadas hidden in the ancient oak trees. She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, smoothing a stray lock of hair and adjusting the collar of her expensive designer blazer. A cold, predatory smile stretched across her face. The banking transfers in San Antonio had been completely successful, and she had managed to subtly copy another batch of financial routing numbers into her encrypted cloud server. She felt utterly invincible. In her mind, she was the apex predator of the corporate world, effortlessly outsmarting a family of wealthy, naive country simpletons who were too blinded by their own archaic values to see the knife inching toward their backs. She reached for the handle of her leather briefcase, but before she could open the car door, a heavy, calloused hand knocked twice on the driver's side window. Chloe jumped, her heart hammering against her ribs. She lowered the glass just enough to hear. Standing in the suffocating heat was Silas, the aging ranch foreman she had viciously berated just days prior for tracking mud onto the patio. His weathered face was entirely unreadable beneath the wide brim of his stained cowboy hat. He did not offer a warm greeting. He did not smile. He simply stared at her with eyes that held the cold, ancient wisdom of the harsh Texas plains. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the sound of the wind. He informed her that Mr. Straight was not in the main house. He said that George had requested her immediate presence down at the old auction barn on the southern edge of the property. Silas explained that George wanted to have a private, off-the-record business meeting to discuss the legal transfer of some highly confidential archival song rights, and he wanted to do it away from the ringing phones of the main office. Chloe's eyes widened slightly, a rush of pure, unadulterated greed flooding her veins. This was it, the ultimate prize. The unreleased masters and the archival rights were the crown jewels her tabloid employers were desperate to acquire. She masked her excitement with a curt, professional nod, completely ignoring the foreman's hardened stare. She rolled the window up, grabbed her briefcase, and stepped out into the oppressive heat. Her sharp heels sank instantly into the dirt, but she did not care. She reached into the deep pocket of her blazer, and her perfectly manicured fingers brushed against the cold, smooth plastic of a high-capacity digital audio recorder. She pressed the small indented button, feeling the satisfying mechanical click that confirmed the device was actively recording. She was going to capture every word, every negotiation, every piece of leverage she needed to destroy the king of country and walk away a millionaire. The walk to the old auction barn felt remarkably long. The wind was picking up, whipping her expensive clothes around her and carrying the distinct, earthy smell of incoming rain. The barn loomed in the darkness like a massive, sleeping beast. It was a cavernous, weathered wooden structure that had stood on the property for over 50 years, a place where generations of cattle had been traded and honest deals had been struck with nothing more than a firm handshake. Chloe pushed open the heavy, creaking wooden side door and stepped into the cavernous space. The air inside was stifling, smelling intensely of aged timber, dry hay, rusted iron, and the sweet, lingering scent of livestock. The vast room was swallowed by shadows, illuminated only by a single industrial incandescent bulb, swinging gently from a thick chain attached to the central rafter. The swinging light cast long, distorted, nightmarish shadows across the dirt floor. Sitting directly beneath the harsh pool of yellow light was George Straight. He was seated on a weathered bale of alfalfa hay, his long legs stretched out in front of him. He was not looking at the door. He was holding a piece of raw cedar wood in his left hand and a sharp silver pocket knife in his right. The only sound in the massive barn was the rhythmic scraping noise of the steel blade carving thin, curling shavings of wood that fell softly onto his worn leather boots. He looked entirely at peace, a solitary figure anchored in the eye of a brewing hurricane. Chloe stepped forward, the arrogant clicking of her heels echoing loudly against the wooden walls. She pasted on her most charming, subservient corporate smile. She greeted him, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, thanking him for the opportunity to discuss the archival rights and assuring him that she was ready to handle the legal paperwork with the utmost discretion. George did not look up immediately. He took one more slow, deliberate pass with the knife, curling a perfect ribbon of cedar. He closed the blade with a sharp, echoing snap that made Chloe flinch involuntarily. He slipped the knife into his denim pocket and slowly raised his head. The warmth that usually resided in his eyes was completely gone, replaced by a devastating, glacial emptiness. He did not offer her a seat. He did not return her greeting. He reached down beside the hay bale and picked up a heavy, rough burlap sack. Without a single word, he tossed the sack through the air. It landed heavily in the dirt directly at Chloe's feet with a sickening metallic clatter. The impact caused the top of the sack to fall open. Chloe's breath caught in her throat, a sudden icy spike of pure terror piercing her chest. Spilling out into the dust were the matte black micro cameras, the blinking audio recorders, the silver flash drives, and the glossy printed contracts bearing the tabloid letterheads. Right on top of the pile lay the photocopied pages of Norma's private diaries and the handwritten lyrics of George's sacred, unreleased songs. The silence that followed was absolute and crushing. The corporate jargon, the rehearsed lies, the polished arrogance completely evaporated from Chloe's mind. She took a trembling step backward, her eyes darting frantically around the dimly lit barn. She tried to speak, her voice cracking, desperately attempting to formulate a defense. She stammered that she had never seen those items before, that someone must have planted them in her room, that this was a massive, terrible misunderstanding, that her lawyers would clear up immediately. George stood up. His tall, imposing frame seemed to absorb the very light in the room. He took 2 slow steps forward, his boots crushing the cedar shavings into the dirt. He spoke, and his voice was not a shout, but a low, vibrating baritone that carried the unstoppable force of a freight train. He told her to stop talking. He told her that she had fundamentally misunderstood the ground she was standing on. She believed that because they lived out in the country, because they prayed before their meals and spoke with a southern drawl, they were slow, ignorant, and easy to exploit. She mistook their kindness for weakness. She mistook their open doors for an invitation to steal. As George spoke, the deep shadows along the perimeter of the barn began to shift. The darkness seemed to detach itself from the walls. Chloe gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Stepping silently into the faint edge of the yellow light were the men she had despised. Silas the foreman stood to the left, his arms crossed over his chest. Beside him were the stable hands, the groundskeepers, and the elderly ranch worker she had humiliated on the porch. There were 6 men in total, forming a silent, impenetrable half-circle around her. They did not hold weapons. They did not make threatening gestures. Their mere presence, their unified, silent judgment, was infinitely more terrifying than any physical threat. They were the guardians of the sanctuary she had tried to desecrate, and they were watching her downfall. George looked down at the stolen items in the dirt, then back up at Chloe's pale, trembling face. He calmly explained the reality of her situation. He told her that while she was driving down the highway, feeling victorious and untouchable, his legal team in Austin and his private investigators in New York had been systematically dismantling her entire existence. He informed her, with chilling precision, that they had traced the encrypted routing numbers she had used. Her offshore bank accounts had been completely frozen by federal injunctions. The tabloids she had signed those lucrative contracts with had been served with massive, ruinous cease and desist orders, threatened with corporate espionage lawsuits so severe that their parent companies had immediately severed all ties with her, burning her as an asset to save themselves. She had no money, no employers, and no escape. Chloe began to sob. The pristine, untouchable corporate fixer was reduced to a shaking, weeping mess in the middle of a dusty barn. She pleaded with him, her voice shrill and desperate, begging for a second chance, promising to sign non-disclosure agreements, promising to disappear and never return to Texas. She reached into her pocket, frantically pulling out the active audio recorder, offering it to him as a pathetic token of surrender. George did not reach for the device. He looked at her tears with the complete indifference of a man watching rain fall on a tin roof. He told her that forgiveness was a matter between her and God, but consequences were a matter of the law. He stated that in Texas, a man's home is his castle, and a threat to his wife's peace of mind is the only unforgivable sin. He slowly reached up and adjusted the brim of his Stetson, the universal cowboy gesture of finality. From the deep shadows near the massive sliding doors at the back of the barn, a new figure emerged. It was Sheriff Jim Hayes, a man who had worn the badge in that county for 3 decades and a lifelong friend of the Straight family. The heavy metallic clinking of the handcuffs hanging from his leather belt cut through the sound of Chloe's sobbing. The sheriff tipped his hat respectfully to George, then walked directly toward the weeping assistant. He did not read her rights with the dramatic flair of a television cop. He simply grabbed her wrists, his grip firm and unyielding, and locked the cold steel bracelets around her wrists. He informed her that her luggage had already been seized as evidence by his deputies, and she was being charged with multiple counts of wiretapping, corporate espionage, and grand larceny. Chloe was escorted out of the barn, her expensive shoes dragging in the dirt, her head bowed in absolute humiliation. She was led past the silent circle of ranch hands, the very people she had treated as inferior, who now watched her being marched away in disgrace. The heavy wooden doors of the barn closed behind her, shutting out the sight of the flashing red and blue lights of the cruiser waiting in the driveway. Inside the barn, the silence returned, thick and peaceful. George looked at Silas. The 2 men shared a long, silent look of mutual respect. No words were needed. The poison had been drawn from the wound. The sanctuary was safe. Weeks passed, and the violent summer storms gave way to the clear, golden days of early autumn. The Texas landscape was reborn, the pastures a vibrant, healthy green, the air crisp and clean. The oppressive, toxic energy that had infected the ranch was completely gone, washed away by the rain and the swift hand of justice. The main house was once again a place of warmth, laughter, and profound peace. Inside the kitchen, the heavy oak table was no longer a chaotic mountain of unmanageable stress. The paperwork was neatly organized into sensible, manageable stacks. Sitting at the table, reviewing a charity proposal with a bright, genuine smile, was Sarah. She was Silas's youngest daughter, a local girl who had just finished her degree in business management at a state university. She wore comfortable denim jeans and worn leather boots. She understood the rhythm of the ranch, she respected the value of a hard-earned dollar, and most importantly, she treated every single person on the property with the dignity and kindness they deserved. Norma stood at the counter, pouring 2 tall glasses of iced sweet tea, feeling a profound sense of relief. She had her home back. She had learned the invaluable lesson that true intelligence and capability do not come dressed in designer suits from the city, but are born from honest roots, loyalty, and a good heart. As the sun began its slow, majestic descent, painting the vast Texas sky in breathtaking strokes of burnt orange, deep violet, and shimmering gold, George and Norma sat together on the wide wooden planks of the back porch. The air smelled of blooming sage and cooling earth. The ranch was quiet, the day's work finally done. George sat in his favorite rocking chair, a beautiful, worn acoustic guitar resting comfortably on his lap. His calloused fingers moved effortlessly over the strings, picking out a slow, melodic rhythm. He leaned his head back, his eyes closed, and began to sing. It was the unreleased song, the deeply personal, sacred melody that had almost been stolen and sold to the highest bidder. The song floated out over the pastures, a testament to enduring love, unbreakable faith, and the quiet, unyielding strength of a family that stood together against the dark. Norma reached out and rested her hand gently over his. He opened his eyes, looking at his wife, and offered a soft, genuine smile. The music filled the evening air, weaving into the rustling leaves of the oak trees and the distant calls of the night birds. The intruder was gone, her name already forgotten, her legacy reduced to a cautionary tale of arrogance, but the ranch remained, the land remained, and the king of country played on, surrounded by the unbreakable walls of a home built on truth, respect, and the unstoppable power of redemption.